Welcome to the Loop Podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we have a super interesting guest on with Scott Payne. Now, Scott, what makes this conversation in my mind so important is that we're talking about what you and I framed as the innovation paradox. How are we innovating so that we're becoming the business of tomorrow that we know we need to do, but while we're still running the business of today? And how do we balance those things? And how do you think about things like change management and innovation? Because you've been at some of the biggest names in consulting firms. You've been at McKinsey, helping business units increase their efficiencies and operations by 30%. You've been at huge brand names like Groupon and Home Chef. You've been everything from chief product officer to you've had marketing roles, finance roles, operation roles. You've got a really good perspective on the business in total and what it takes to evolve and innovate over time. And that's what we're going to be digging into today. But what I'd love to do is just give you an opportunity, if you wouldn't mind, do a little bit better job expanding on your background before we get started.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thanks, Steve, for that introduction. And thanks for having me on, most importantly. Yeah, just to elaborate a little bit on my background, I've had about a 15-year career so far that's been primarily focused on moments of innovation and change within organizations. Some of that within a consulting context, both at McKinsey and as an independent consultant, some of that at scaling stage organizations. Spent a couple of years at Groupon and then spent several years at Home Chef, which is the US #2 in the meal kit industry. I've worked across several different functions, multiple different industries, but the thing that's really tied them together has been working in organizations that have a very strong established business, but are in a moment of pivot or change where they're trying to do something new. Either it's a business model that was under explosive growth and now needs to identify the next source of growth, or at McKinsey, I did a lot of work with teams that were looking to revitalize the productivity of their team. At Groupon, I spent a lot of time focused on evolutions to the business model and both looking internally at how they could run more productively and then externally about the products that they were bringing to market.
Here's what I would love to do. There's so many different ways we could start into this conversation, but you and I started talking last time about what you framed as the consumer demand evolution, and that could actually present a challenge. We all know that the customer, the consumer is the highest voice of authority in our business. And we always know that our customers and their voice, if they're complex, they're always changing. We need to stay in tune with that. But tell us about this evolution and the challenge that it presents for going through the innovation phases you're talking about.
Consumers are not a static entity. Some industries, you can reasonably rely on people will be buying the same thing in 50 years as they are today. And some they aren't. Especially recently, there's been a lot of moments of broader societal change that have driven changes in consumer preferences as well. Two of the businesses that I've been in operating roles in, one is Groupon, which at the time was the fastest company to $1 billion in revenue in history. There was this viral moment that it created something that had explosive levels of growth, but didn't necessarily have an organic market that was going to continue that growth forever. So a lot of what I worked on during our time there is how do we make that more sustainable in a way that can carry the company into the future. I also spent some time in the meal kit industry, which is a fascinating business to have been in over the last several years. Meal kits as a whole did not exist until 2013 or so, or at least did not exist in the US. We were riding the wave of the creation of a new industry, something that consumers saw resonated with them. It was an easier, more convenient, sometimes even cheaper way to eat at home, and for many people to learn how to cook for the first time. Then there was a second wave with COVID where the industry experienced it once in a generational change that you will never really see anything like that again, where everyone in the world simultaneously needed to be at home and needed to figure out a way to eat at home. Our business grew 50% in 3 weeks. So that was an incredible moment, an incredible thing to be a part of. It also means that shift swings back the other direction. Several years later, as things are starting to open up again, as companies are bringing people back to office, those consumer preferences are changing back the other direction. So we need to be thinking about how do we stay current with just the macro trends that are happening in the world.
It's interesting because as we talk about innovation, as we talk about change, one of the things that you said was a dynamic that you just have to address is internal organization dynamics that can make these kind of pivots really difficult to make. Tell me a little bit about that because you've had a lot of experience in this area.
Across several different entities. Where to start is probably the first question there. There's a lot of advantages when you're working in an established company that's trying to do something new. You have a lot of advantages that you would have over trying to do it at a startup. You have the resources of a broader organization, you have the talent of a broader organization. You can operate new businesses for a period of time as you need to get them stood up. On the flip side, there's organizational inertia, the processes that have already been built. There's communicating change to the organization, explaining to people why we're potentially moving in a direction over what's made the company successful in the past, explaining why upper management is maybe disproportionately spent on a smaller chunk of the business, thinking through risk you want to take and how different it is from your current brand. New innovations happen at existing organizations that you need to work through not just what is the change, but how do you lead the organization through it as well.
So, interesting is that making shifts in innovation and pivoting inside of an organization, it has to start internally. There's got to be an internal change plan, really, that you have to put into motion. And I'd love to just get into your thinking about how do you get that plan rolling? What do you think is the most important part of that?
I think one way to think about this is you're asking the organization to do something very different for the purposes of long term success. So, in the short term, anytime you're making a disruptive change to the organization, and this is all standard Clayton Christensen innovator's dilemma. In the short term, you're asking for disproportionate resources, disproportionate management attention, potentially a distraction for the organization for something you're not 100% sure is going to work and will be a smaller portion of the business for a period of time. So there's a few things that you need to do in order to create the conditions to be successful there. One is you need to get conviction on it being the right decision to begin with. So really understanding the why for yourself as an executive team before you start to communicate that out. What is the new business model, the new initiative, the new whatever it might be that we think will lead to step change success once you fully move from A to B? I don't think you can measure that in terms of what is the day one launch going to be? It really needs to be done on a 3 to 5 year vision. And you need to believe that the size of prize is large enough and that your ability to execute on that is high enough. When you undertake major change initiatives, you're never 100% sure that they're going to work. So, really doing as much homework as you can up front on understanding the calculus of what is the upside and what is the chance that we can get there is a big piece of it. Then you're thinking about you're not going to know day one whether you've actually unlocked that. So, how do you design the conditions for innovation to flourish? Is really how I would think about the next phase of work. There's a few things that need to happen in order to make that come to life. One is to use the startup term, what's the MVP? What's the version of a test that the highest confidence that you've given the new process everything, every chance it has to succeed, but you're doing it at the smallest possible scale where you can do it with the most dedicated attention. That actually looks different depending on what the initiative is that you're doing. I've seen versions of this where it's we want to do something that's a relatively simple internal change. We're going to spin up an internal team. We'll try something new, see if it works. I've seen versions of it that require an 8 figure capital investment to get started. And it's really what's that activation energy to get started? What's the balance of giving the test the highest chance to succeed versus making sure you're not getting out over your skis too early. So that's one component of it. One is making sure that you really understand whatever it is new that you're trying to do, that you understand from first principles, how should that work? The risk that most organizations are going to have is having your thought process on this clouded by the business that you run today. And the hardest part to get right is thinking about ignoring the business that I have today with whatever I'm trying to create next. What are the economics of the business? What are the processes that you need? What is the talent that you need? What is the customer that you need? What experience that should they have? It can be an 80% overlap with what you do today, but you need to design it from scratch to make sure that you've given yourself the highest chance to succeed as possible. Related to that, something I feel very strongly about is you need at least some proportion of the organization that is 100% dedicated to thinking about the new business problem, completely divorced from your existing business. It may not be a lot. To the point that I was mentioning earlier, you can't necessarily go spin up a 50-person team with your highest capability people day one. You need to be really thoughtful about, is that actually a smart use of organizational resources out the gates? But you also are not likely to succeed if you have a bunch of people thinking about this problem with 20% of their brain. The thing I found to be most important in organizational design is thinking about, coming back to the point I made earlier, it really sits downstream of what is the business model, what is the thing that you're trying to do to be successful, and making sure you have the most dedicated attention on the areas that are the most different from what you do today. I'll give you one example on this point. When I was at Home Chef, I was working on our retail business. So this is a D2C company that moved into retail after our acquisition from Kroger. We tried a bunch of different organizational models. We tried having retail be embedded within the same functional teams as the D2C team. We tried having a giant retail team that was held completely separately from the rest of the organization. Each of those had their flaws. When it was embedded within the functions, there wasn't enough attention put toward how is this different. When it was completely separate, it was too divorced from the rest of the company. The version of it that we had that was the most successful was actually a hybrid where we thought very tactically about what specific functions are the most distinct in the retail business model versus what we do today, and came up with two. One is demand point, because in the fundamental economic difference between those two business models is, in DTC, we got an order and we fulfilled the order. In retail, we were pushing a product out and hoping it sold. And that required just a structurally different way that you handled supply forecasting and things along those lines. The other was store operations. So, what happens when the product hits the store? What does it look like? How is your communication with the store? What are your signage? Things along those lines. It just did not exist in an e-commerce context. Dedicating those functions while leaving marketing embedded within the organization, finance embedded within the organization, anything that was close enough to your existing business. So we've gone through understanding what's the MVP, understanding the economics of the business, dedicated resources, and then what your definition of success. It's unrealistic in most cases to assume that you're reaching nirvana day one. So understanding what are the leading indicators that would tell you that the model that you've created has legs. Most commonly, it's going to be proving it at small scale, but there's a lot of different ways to get there. And then we talked about vision, we've talked about testing the hypothesis. The other big piece is going to be communicating the change to the organization. So any large established organization, even if it's a startup, even if it's relatively new, if you're trying to do something different than what you've been doing before, there's bound to be some confusion. Why is there time? Why is there attention? Why is there something different happening? So there's a few pieces that are really critical to get right as you're talking to the team at large. One is the why. So the same exercise the executive team would have done. You have to realize that your executives are going to be ahead of in terms of how much they've thought about it versus the rest of the organization. And bringing everyone through kind of a simplified version of that same process of believing and understanding that there's a 3-year vision here, there's a 5-year vision here, there's something that may not work day one, but is in service of something that will be long term successful. Building evidence of early momentum is a big piece. So you're going to go through a period where there's disproportionate resources, time, attention being put to something that's a very small percentage of the business. Some portion of your organization is going to say, why? Why are we putting this much time? Is it only about this? Is what about me? And being able to show a physical product that is something that people can rally behind. You can show early signs of metrics that are moving in the right direction. Really, any quick wins that you can deliver to prove progress and momentum, even if some total results aren't there. And then having agents of change as well, having people embedded within the organization who are true believers. You can't fake this. You have to have somebody who's actually bought in. I'll draw on a McKinsey example here. I did a number of initiatives at McKinsey where it was about coming into a business unit, running a pilot team for some form of a process change that then ideally you'd be changing a team or developing a team that would roll that change out to the rest of the organization after you left. The thing that was always the biggest aha was when it stopped being the consultants that were talking about the success or the influence, where you had, I did one project that was a call center in Omaha, and we were working on making that call center more effective. And the thing that really got people in was when one of the call center agents stood up and said, I love this. I'm more productive. I'm communicating better with my peers. I'm working in a more effective way. I see the vision here and I'm really excited about where it's going. I want to be the one to carry it forward. And he actually took on a new role as a change leader. It was a career opportunity for him, but it was a very powerful moment for the organization to be able to see. It's one thing if McKinsey comes and talks. It's another when someone who's been a long-term employee who's worked in one model for a long time tries something new, stands up and says this.
And both sides really are important. The McKinsey side is one of the world's most well-known consulting brands. So if McKinsey believes in it, then you believe there's a foundation there. You believe there's strong thinking, there's validation that it's happened. But when you see one of your peers talk about it, I saw a study recently that we trust peers at the same level that we do scientists. So that communication, everything successful in every business comes down to the people who execute on it. I literally had on another podcast a three-time B2B CMO, and she was at some of the biggest Fortune 500 companies that you can imagine. And she said, "See, there's one thing I want to talk about on the podcast, which is execution. It's all I want to talk about because that's where it all falls apart." So, what I'm taking away from what you're saying here is all of this is pieces of the puzzle to make sure that the people, the organization themselves, have what they need in order to be able to deliver on this innovation, this pivot, this change. And if you can't convince the rank and file or starting with the executive team, it's just going to go nowhere, no matter how good of an idea it is.
Something you said reminded me of when I was at McKinsey, we had a three-part framework for how change is delivered. And I think it's something I've carried with me because I've seen it play out in many different contexts. This is the context of process improvement, but I think you can apply it to any other innovation as well. The three pieces were, what is the actual process change, the physical change? What we called management systems, which are, what are you measuring? What are you recording? How do you design the organization? How do you evaluate people? All of those management processes. And then the third is mindsets and behaviors, hearts and minds, if you will. There's a number of stats out there about 80% of change initiatives fail at organizations. And the biggest failure point is only spent on the first part and not the second two. So it's one thing to come in and say, I see a better way that we should work, go do it. That's actually not going to be very successful for a bunch of reasons. One, you haven't created the conditions for success. Two, people don't like to be talked down to. Who are you if you are an executive who hasn't worked in the day to day or you're a consultant coming in from the outside? You have actual buy in order to execute anything differently. And it really requires resonance across all three of those pieces. We're doing something different. We're rewarding you in a different way or evaluating you in a different way that your peers or yourself or the world around you is actually bought into what's happening. I'll give you an example maybe on the second piece, which is the management systems. When I was at Groupon, one of the projects that I worked on was an innovation team called the Future is Now initiative, which was basically working on new business models to roll out to the organization. And one of the big ones was, if you think about the traditional Groupon product that most people knew was a deal product. So we'd call up a small business, we'd get a deal with them where it was, hey, you're going to offer 40% off to your customer. We're going to take a little bit of margin off of that. And it becomes a marketing platform essentially. That was a very successful business model, obviously, fastest to $1 billion in revenue in history. But the challenge on it is it means the merchant's giving up a lot of their profit to either the customer or to Groupon. So we were testing on a new product called card linked offers, which is basically something that's tied to your credit card where you're not buying a deal in advance. You just already have, hey, I have a Visa card. It gives me 10% off at the pizza place down the street. I'll go regularly because I know that's something that's available. Very economics on that business model and very different definition of success. Where I'm getting to on this is it's a very different definition of success in terms of what you want your salespeople to be able to do In the traditional deals product, success was much more based on get me the whale deal, get me the Chicago Cubs or the aquarium or something that was a really big ticket item. In a card linked offers world, it's a volume play. You need as much coverage as possible. A Mac that's lit up with Groupon deals all over the place. The challenge we ran into as we started to execute that change was we were still paying people on the profit that their deals brought in. So we could tell people all day, I want you working on volume, close 6 restaurants in the same block. But as long as my pay system is set up so that I'm paying you on 70% of your income comes from one deal, you're going to spend all of your time relationship managing that deal or figuring out what's the next area of growth on it. So just a big piece to get right as you're working on this. It's most salient for sales because they are so motivated by their commission structure. But these types of things happen in lots of different organizations where it's either not actually changed or it's not clear that the way that I get new projects or I get promoted or I get public recognition, whatever form of recognition matters to people, is actually in alignment with the change that you're asking them to make.
I want to ask a question that's as if you and I were just at a coffee shop and we were just talking about your past experiences. And I said, Scott, if there was just like something that you learned that you're like going through these change initiatives, these innovation strategies, like what would you do differently? How would you approach it differently this time? We haven't gone through all of that. You have. What have you learned?
One is maybe counterintuitive. One is pick your battles. I've been in a couple of different roles or situations where I was trying to, or the executive team was trying to do many changes at the same time. And having more humility about not biting off more than you can chew, making sure that whatever you're asking to be done is worth it. And it really goes to that first piece that I said up front on understanding the vision, getting very clear on the why, and is it worth it? And more diligence there. Not to say that the initiatives that I've run didn't have diligence, but even as somebody who's done this for a long time, I still overestimate how much change, how quickly you can drive through an organization.
Anytime, any pivot that you make inside of an organization, it has an impact. And if it's a big change, it's going to have a big impact on the customer and the CX strategy of the business itself. How much thinking as you're going through these pivots, these innovations, are you thinking about impact on CX and that as a massive part of the value of what you're doing?
I think anything I'm saying for the organization goes doubly for the customer because you don't get the opportunity to explain it to them. If you're in the building and you have somebody who says, I don't understand what we're doing here, it doesn't click for me, it doesn't make sense. I don't understand the difference between product A and product B. I don't understand why we're investing time and energy here. You can sit down with them, you can have a conversation. You may or may not be successful at convincing everybody, but your organization is going to have more context. With a customer, you only get one shot. When they look at your website, it either works or it doesn't. If they see your product offering, they either like it or they don't. And they're not going to spend time trying to gather context and understand this is 80% of what I'm looking for and the rest of the 20% is coming, but it's not there yet. They're just going to say this is exciting me or it isn't. So making sure you're really targeted with your customer on what specifically are we offering you in a way that's clear, directly solving in a way that understands their problem, speaks to their problem, and actually solves their problem.
I love that thinking because we can get into the thinking of MVPs and this is stage one and we're going to roll it out. It's going to get much better over time. But to the customer, it is what it is. They're not in the strategy sessions with you. They're just interacting with the new service, the new product, the new experience that they're presented with.
And they don't care that, hey, this is good today, but it'll get better next
Mhm.
week. They care about what am I buying right now?
I think one of my biggest takeaways from this conversation is that no matter what we do, when it gets real, when it's in front of a customer, it has to be ready for the customer to interact with it in a way that's going to create a positive experience for them. I think that designing it and thinking about it and getting the people and the organization behind it, there's lots of studies that show that more engaged employees equal more engaged customers, more engaged consumers. And so there's a lot of parts to this. So I wanted to ask, because there's so many parts in our poor human brains, we can only remember about 2 or 3 things at a time. In about 30 seconds, what would you want the most important takeaway from our entire conversation to be?
We've talked about the importance of execution. We've talked about the importance of bringing people along through that execution. We've talked about the importance of clarity to a customer. I think pick one problem and solve it really is probably the answer I would give here. That cuts across everything that we've talked about here. When we talked about what are the things that you need to do to be successful, you need to have a very clear vision of why. And the way that you do that is by picking the most important problem to go after, the one change that's most worth an organization's effort. Talk about testing that hypothesis. You want to give the test the highest chance of success as possible. You can't do that by diluting attention. You can't do that by trying to copy your existing business model. You need to give it 100% effort at figuring out how do we make this one change stick. And you need to communicate it very clearly to both your employee base and the customer. You can have no open threads. You can have no lack of clarity. You have an opportunity to clarify for your employee base, but not for your customer. You get one shot.
I have to tell you, the mission of this whole podcast is, in the end, how we bring together experts from all walks of the business, all walks of the world, different levels in the organization, and how do we learn from each other to overall CX has been McKinsey actually did the study on it, that CX is the number one differentiator these days. So anything we do has to be put through that lens. And I just wanted to say, you gave us a lot to think about today. And if we take everybody's insights and perspectives and experiences and put it together, that's the rising tide that lifts all boats. And I just wanted to say thank you because you were an amazing part of that rising tide today.